We're going to commence the regional outlook sessions, and as the sun rises from the east to the west, we're going to start in Asia. Then we move to Africa and Latin America. We've got three fantastic speakers, David Russell, Ato Giassi, and Jay Gallegos. And in 2016, Chile became the largest independent renewable energy developing country in Latin America with over 160 developers, and is still blazing a trail in that region. Other interesting things to note, in 2016 as well, development finance institutions provided almost $600 million worth of risk mitigation instruments to the financing of renewable energy projects on the African continent as well. And in Asia, we're seeing countries like India and many places across Southeast Asia where there's an increasing appetite from investors, institutional investors, DFIs, and other types of financing producers in devising new and innovative strategies. And these are some of the themes we're going to explore. The speakers from the various regions are going to be talking about the bankability of projects in their part of the world. They'll be touching on some of the regulatory and legal and policy challenges they also see in their respective markets. And we will get the time to pose some questions to them. So without further ado, I'm going to welcome the very first speaker, who is a founding partner and CEO of Equis. Yes, David Russell, one of Asia's largest independent private equity infrastructure firms. So please welcome David. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. What I'm going to say today obviously just applies to Asia. I'm not going to be PC, so I know people in Europe like being PC. We're not very PC in Asia. And so we're going to say it as it is. What I want to do just very quickly is talk a little bit about ourselves, and then I want to talk about what we did and evolved, or how we evolved, and what resulted in what was quite an outstanding result this year, where we exited this business to a group of European, North American private equity groups, GIP. Today, Equis Energy is the largest renewable energy IPP in the Asia-Pac region. We're number one in solar in Japan. We're number one in solar in Taiwan. We're number one in solar in the Philippines. We're number one in solar in Australia. We're number one in solar in Indonesia. We're in the top 5 in Thailand. In fact, we're the largest RE foreign player in that country. And in India, we're top 10. You'll note there, obviously, China's a pretty big and yawning gap. It's one of the largest RE markets in the region. We looked at it, and obviously, as you would appreciate in developing markets, discipline's important. We took the view, from our perspective as a foreign player, the Chinese renewable energy market wasn't one that we could invest into successfully in terms of our targets. But it is a very active market, a very growing market, but it tends to be really funded by the domestic players in that market, not surprisingly, because it's one of the largest suppliers of equipment globally, and they tend to invest in their own market with a fairly low cost of capital. About the region, if you don't know gigawatts, doesn't really matter. All you need to know is that it's a very big region today, and it's growing faster than anywhere else globally, by a factor of a bit over 3 times versus Europe, and 4 times, nearly 5 times the US. It is an incredibly large region, both in terms of installed capacity today, but then in terms of new installed capacity that's being funded. We expect just on $2.2 trillion to be invested in the Asia-Pac region over the next 12 years alone. And that's just in renewable energy. So this is a region that's very critical in terms of your activities. It's very critical in terms of climate change for those that are focused on it, and it's very important for us, obviously, as well. We as a business focus on these 7 key markets. And so even when you do exclude China from the equation, you can see that each of these markets today is quite significant, but the growth trajectory that we're seeing in these markets, and this is what we're seeing, and we expect that as batteries become disruptive, it will change again. As people start to embrace hybrid power, it will change again. Off-grid solutions, it will change again. But just on what we're seeing today, these markets are facing incredible growth in terms of renewable energy. We decided to bring in GIP into our business, and in fact, we sold it for a bit over $5 billion. That's the largest renewable energy generation acquisition in the Asia-Pac region, but it's the largest globally in history. And what's interesting is the lessons we learned from setting up this business in terms of being able to grow it very quickly from what was a nascent, and renewable energy was a nascent sector in the Asia-Pac region back in 2011, 2012, to a business that has over 180 projects and a bit over today, 11.3 gigawatts in its portfolio. The returns are attractive, but they can be misleading. That's a compressed exit return, 44% equity IRR. And we'll talk a bit about returns in a moment. In fact, why don't we talk about it now? I'd be pretty interested. Perceptions are quite powerful versus reality. And people are very aware there's China, there's India, there's Southeast Asia. But just by a show of hands, who thinks that we make more money out of India? It tends to be the most popular market. Well, that's pretty interesting, isn't it? Nobody thinks we make more money out of India. Rajpal's going to be disappointed by that, but you're actually right. But there's more money flowing into India from Europe and North America than any other country in Southeast Asia. Who thinks we make more money today out of Southeast Asia, so Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, versus, say, Taiwan, which has just scrapped its nuclear program in favour of renewables, or Australia, where we're seeing a lot of disruption in terms of the sector. We heard about that earlier this morning. Who thinks we make more money out of Southeast Asia? Okay, a few more. Well, you're right relative to India. Who thinks we make more money out of Australia? You're sort of right on an exit. We get better compression in developed markets. But what people don't realise is that the lowest cost of capital market that we have in the region, and one of the hardest to get into, is the market we make the most money out of, Japan. We make a ton of money out of this place. In fact, Japan just auctioned off, or sought to auction off, 500 megawatts I'll talk in US dollars, at 21 cents, under a 20-year fit. 21 cents. You guys should be diving over 21 cents. They couldn't auction it all off. Only 10% of the auction was actually applied for. And so the Japanese, in their way, turned into themselves and said, well, maybe we lowered prices too quickly. We should increase them. That's at 21 cents. The other misnomer about Asia is that when people come to developing markets, they think 20% is the right return. You're not going to make 20% on a long-term basis in Asia. Oops, wrong way. You're probably going to make 10 to 15%, and that's if you follow a business model that I'm about to talk about. Asia is a tough, competitive market. 10 to 15% is a good return. It's a good return for a business that's a 85, 90% EBITDA margin business. You're getting 20-year contracts with government utilities. Don't look for 20%. You won't find it, and you'll probably be misled. You're probably talking to the wrong people. So what makes solar bankable in Asia? Well, sorry about the small writing. There's a whole bunch of stuff up there that we're all familiar with. We like to worry about PPAs, environmental approvals, securing land, construction procurement. That's all important, but it's not the fundamental issues we're focused on in terms of making solar bankable in Asia. We confronted, in our very first projects in Thailand, we confronted an approval process where there was a government official that said that they were overworked, that to approve our project, and it was the last approval we needed, it was basically confirmation that we'd completed the project and could dispatch power into the grid, that they'd have to do a little bit of extra work on the weekend, and that they're probably underpaid as well, and so could we just supplement his income by 20,000 bucks? Oh, okay, we were told it was business practice. How many of you think that we should have actually spoken to our lawyers and got some feedback as to whether this was legal or not, and would have reverted it up to the legal department and said, guys, can you deal with this request for $20,000 for this final approval? Yeah, not too many. Okay, so you're not too legal here. Fair enough. How many of you would have relied on their local partner to resolve the problem? Yeah, fair play. Okay. And how many of you would just do nothing? Most of you, by the looks of it. We haven't got a lot of activity here. The most important thing in Asia, and it was something that I was taught by my mentor, is always act lawfully. And that's easier said than done. From inception of this business, we've sought to act lawfully, and it's cost us millions of dollars. Millions of dollars in lawsuits. You know, little issues like dealing with a $20,000 request can cost you millions of dollars in legal action. And so it's very easy for people to be tempted not to act lawfully. The other thing we remind ourselves of, though, is that there is no law that says you have to be fair. And in fact, to get a reasonable result, you've usually got to be unreasonable. So recently, you saw on the front of the presentation there, we completed what was Southeast Asia's largest solar facility in the Philippines, a 133 megawatt facility. A few months ago, the NPA, communist organisation, decided to use it for target practice. Came down with automatic weapons, grenade launchers. They were terrible shots. They only took out 200 panels, and half of their grenades didn't explode. But our contractor got really nervous because these guys are on the terrorist watch list in Europe, and they just froze. And they reported it up through their chain, through legal, and legal froze. They didn't know what to do. One of the most important things we realised when we were investing in the Philippines and in all these markets is that, one, we have to have control. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But two, community involvement is very important. And you have to own those relationships. You don't own the relationships, you freeze. You don't know what to do. You rely on your partner, and the decision-making, the control of your investment is now completely out of your hands. And so in that particular case, we already had relationships with the local mayor and the local community. They knew who the NPA operatives were, and we were able to deal with that situation without having to pay any money, and very quietly and very simply, to everybody's satisfaction, including the NPA. The other thing that surprises a lot of people when we talk about our business in Asia, and this is where I would be interested in your feedback, is moving to a developing market. Whether you're looking at investing in a whether it's LATAM, Africa, we're going to hear about in a moment, or Asia, how many of you start by trying to identify a local partner? And that local partner is really going to help you navigate the sector. How many would identify with a local partner? Yeah, I think most of you. I think most of you would fairly say that you look to partner locally. We think that's an absolute disaster. Absolute disaster. The best way to lose value in Asia is to find a local partner and invest with them. And we've seen it over and over again, whether it's in the renewable space or any other space. And we're infrastructure investors and energy investors, but in every sector, local partners are a disaster. You must keep control of everything that involves decision-making. And this is really important, not only to dealing with value, but also creating value. We have 180 projects. We control 100% of them. Now, as a private equity group, we morphed. We stopped being a fund manager and became a developer. Our business today, as you probably saw on the first slide, we became an employer of 326 people. We became a developer. We built the local partner. The local partner was us. We hired these people in all the facets of the disciplines that we were investing into. So whether it's land procurement, we hired land experts. Grid connections, we hired people out of the local grid companies that helped us with grid assessments, identifying capacity. We need to know where the capacity is in order to secure the land. Design, resource assessments. We now do EPCM. Solar is probably the one renewable energy resource that lends itself to EPCM, construction management, in-house. It's simple. We've in-housed the O&M. Anything that involves a partner, or a payment to a third party, we're hiring people internally to do it. And what that means is we have complete control over every decision-making facet of our project. We understand what's going on. We can make decisions quickly. The best way to lose value, as I said, and the most common way, is to partner locally. And we just don't do it at all. It doesn't even make it to our investment committee. So what's the model? Control, control, control. Build your own in-house management teams on all facets. We recently completed a project in Taiwan in 2.5 months. So why do you need to be wasting 6 months putting your leverage in place for construction financing? The majority of our projects, we 100% equity underwrite. And then we'll put the debt in place if we want to, post-COD. Better pricing, better terms. We employ our own people to do the land. That's the first step in community involvement. We do the development ourselves. Sometimes you might buy a partially developed project, but complete it yourself because the guy selling it to you is not interested in perfecting it. And we're already into EPCM and obviously O&M for our solar. Sourcing. If you've got a development team and your own land people, you're going to be able to source and create your own deal flow. It becomes organic. Every single deal that we've done, 180 projects, we source ourselves. We don't need to acquire from others. You can buy, but I'd buy during development where your team can perfect that project. You can partner, but ignorance is bliss. Financing, as we said, good assets will find deals. I hear all this talk about green bonds and blended financing and everything else. It's all a nonsense. Good deals will find money. You don't need to worry about the money. You've got guys like FMO, DG, they'll help you find it as well. But good deals will always find money. Doesn't matter whether it's renewables or not. And put, if you can, the financing in after construction and fund your growth with it if that's what you want to do. Just quickly, and I'm running out of time, when we sold our business, and people ask us, how did we get $5 billion for the business? That's a crazy price. What was quite interesting, we were selling not just brownfield assets are easy to understand and price. Everyone in this room can price a brownfield asset. And construction assets, you can do the same. Solar's easy. It's an easy business to understand. What's the hard thing is getting people to pay for the shovel-ready assets, the advanced pipeline, and maybe the not-so-advanced pipeline. The only way you're going to get people to pay for that is if you can convince them you can deliver on it. And the only way you can get people, or you can convince people that you can deliver on it, is if you've got the people with the track record in your team, in your management team. We've got the development guys that have done it for the 180 assets. We've got the in-house expertise in construction management. So buy into when we talk about compressing construction margins and being able to outcompete our competitors. We're already in-housing the O&M. What was interesting in our sale process was that the ultimate buyers, and not just the ultimate buyer, but the bidders as well, they were ascribing around 70% of the value to the brownfield and construction assets. So 30%, we created 30%, about $800 million, we created by getting them to ascribe value to the development assets. That would not have been possible if we didn't have all that in-house expertise and the track record of doing it. So if I can leave you with one key message, control, control, control. Don't partner, be patient. Indonesia, it took us 3 years to build a management team, but we're now the #1 player in the wind and solar sector in that market because we just fast-forwarded past everybody else, being able to do it in-house. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. Some really hard-hitting recommendations, which we're going to probe you on a bit later on. The second speaker we have for the regional presentation is Atto Jassy. He's a Senior Investment Director at the Africa Finance Corporation. They're a specialist infrastructure finance institution. And Atto has been involved in several landmark projects in Africa, including the Azura IPP and Senpa IPP in Ghana. So please welcome Atto for his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. As she said, my name is Atto JC. I'm based in Lagos, in Nigeria. I work for the Africa Finance Corporation. I'm going to spend a few minutes just introducing AFC to those of you who don't know us, and then talk a little bit about the Africa landscape as we see it today, almost Power 101, and then talk a little bit about how we see it evolving over the next 10 years. So AFC was set up about 11 years ago, 2007. We are set up as a public-private partnership. So our shareholding is about 60% private sector and about 40% public sector. We cover 5 sectors. So we cover natural resources, transportation and logistics. We cover power, heavy industries, and telecommunications. We are completely focused on Africa. We don't do anything outside Africa. If you look at our business model, there are elements of it that are similar to a development financing institution. So when we look at projects, it's important to us that they have high developmental impact. At the same time, we have elements that make us similar to our commercial banking, that our projects have to have high profit potential. So we will not simply do a transaction because it's good for the industry. Again, other elements that make us similar to any investment bank is that we look at senior debt, we look at mezzanine, we look at equity. But I think the thing that separates us from everyone out there is we do project development. So we've got a dedicated team completely focused on project development. Some of the transactions we've done is, say, Sen Power, which is a 340 megawatt combined cycle power plant in Ghana, which should be commissioned in about 4 months. We were involved in Kabiolika, which we believe to be the first private sector developed wind farm in Africa. That was in Cape Verde. It's about 26 megawatts. At the moment, we are developing transactions in Djibouti. We've got a wind farm and development there. We've got thermal plants in Benin, in Ghana. So there's quite a bit going on in there. So what does Africa look like? As I say, this is really Power 101. A lot of the data I'm going to talk about here comes from the International Renewable Energy Agency. So I'd just like to appreciate that. So the slide on the left really lays out Africa in terms of the 5 regions, right? So you've got North Africa, going from the left side on that to the right, you've got West, Central, East, and then Southern Africa. I think the first thing that to me strikes me, and maybe just coming down, you've got each of those line items. The first is North, then you've got West, East, Central, and Southern at the bottom. So this really is a breakdown of the per capita consumption per person for Africa. And the first thing that strikes me is, irrespective of which line item you look at, Africa is really, really low. So they say the average consumption for the world today is about 3,500 kilowatt hours per person, which is about a megawatt per person. So that's about right. And even for the region with the most power, which is Southern Africa, they are only at 2,061. So which is about 2/3 of the world average. The second thing that strikes me about Africa and how serious the supply situation is that if you look at Southern Africa towards the bottom and Northern Africa, they are completely separate from, if you will, the middle band of Africa, so West, Central, Eastern Africa, where your average consumption is almost less than 150 kilowatt hours per person. That's probably less than most people here use a couple of months. So the supply situation is really quite serious. Just moving to the right side of the page, which talks about the generation mix, and I've been fascinated by the earlier session where we talk about 100% renewable. For Africa, we are nowhere near 100% renewable. Let's just be very clear about that. I mean, thermal today is about 80.5%. Hydro is sitting about 20%. If you look at renewable generally, whether that's wind or whether it's PV, it's still less than 1%. So even if you say it's completely dominated by solar, solar in Africa today doesn't even contribute 1% of the power generation. So just delving a little bit deeper into solar generation, I mean, it's clear that the opportunity for solar in Africa exists. I mean, we believe Africa has about 40% of the potential for global power across the world, which is massive. And yet, investments are incredibly low. Most of it is driven by PV, but if you look at the chart, just the bottom right hand of the page, you can see that it's really low. So Africa today still receives less than 10% of the global solar power investments. We've seen a slight increase in the last few years, but it's still incredibly slow. Now, that increase is being driven by a handful of things. One is government programs. Again, these tend to be very concentrated. So I know you can't see too well, but the left side of the graph is broken down Africa per country. And you will see that the top, which is Northern Africa, has a reasonable amount of investment. Southern Africa has a reasonable, but again, the middle band is completely, it's virtually empty. Some of the things driving government interest, and these are things that we expect to keep scaling up, are more concentrated programs, so driving financing, so things like Get Fit and scaling solar, which are creating some programs. But again, these are all fairly slow in terms of how they're developing. The other thing that is pushing growth in Africa is really two sectors. So the mining industry in Africa is really driving the development of renewable power. As most of you would know in here, it's about 20 or 30% of the cost line item for mines is about 20, 30%, for power is about 20, 30%. And so they are looking to replace that with solar and diesel hybrids. We're also seeing a massive push in the telecommunications space, particularly towers. We estimate that right now there are about 150,000 towers across Africa that are driven by solar and/or hybrid systems. The last key theme we're seeing coming across in Africa is the mini-grid and off-grid systems. It's very different across Africa. So if you look at East Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, and the likes, they have taken the lead, and you are seeing fairly large take-up. The rest of Africa is lagging a little bit, but we're seeing West Africa starting to pick up. I mean, I think this is believed to be the next big push for Africa. The estimate is that by 2022, this should contribute about 3,000 megawatts to Africa. Now, 3,000 megawatts to you may not be massive, but for Africa, that's huge. There are issues around that, and as to whether it really becomes a sustainable or whether it fundamentally changes Africa. Because the reality is today, Africa is still in dire need of base load power, right? So until we get to the point where storage is affordable and makes it easy to generate base load power, we don't fundamentally see that changing Africa. So, where do we see Africa in the next 10 years? This is my last slide. Firstly, we do expect solar PV in particular to keep growing. We think this is going to be driven by just tariffs going down, and you're seeing that as far as EPC costs coming down, production costs. There is also a push because the narrative is changing, right? So part of the narrative is just governments becoming more aware of the implications for the climate, but also a lot of it being driven by international donors and international partners, right? So, the IFCs, the FMOs, the DGs, everybody's now talking about investing sustainably and making sure that that push is coming through. We do expect this to drive more government programs, which is, again, it's about the funding. But we expect process risks to also increase. Now, those of you who follow Africa would be aware that there's been recent programs in Egypt, in South Africa, in Nigeria, most of which have moved in fits and starts. We don't expect that to fundamentally change in the near future. Again, that is part of government needing to focus on the bigger picture, right? So if PV is really only going to fundamentally change the world by 100, 200, 300 megawatts, that for government is not a fundamental change. Africa is pushing about industrialization, and that means we need lots of generation, lots of baseload power on grid. We expect to see significant downward pricing pressure. This is already coming through, and a lot of this is driven by standardized documentation. It's being driven by the funding programs where we're seeing. So, in the last 2-3 years, if you were involved in the South African renewable program, maybe 3 years, you would have gotten tariffs around 13, 14, 15 cents per kilowatt hour. Today, governments are expecting tariffs in the 7.5 region. That is really, really difficult to sustain. It has to do with the risk-adjusted return that people expect. Again, there is so much process risk around Africa. A lot of the utilities are not in the greatest of condition. But we do expect this pressure to keep coming through. The last thing, again, and I think I talked about this earlier, is the off-grid or the mini-grid systems. We do expect to see this continually increasing. I think that's clear. But as I say, we don't think that's fundamentally going to change Africa. This is a view that we hold because we think Africa really needs baseload power. Africa is pushing for industrialization, So in as much as we are worried about the climate, as everybody should be, We also do think that there is a good reason where a jurisdiction has fossil fuel, whether that is coal or whatever it is, that there should be a good basis for doing it. I think the second thing that we think is going to constrain off-grid or mini-grid power is just the lack of access to deep funding models. Right? It is an industry that is still in its infancy. I think most funders in this room are struggling to figure out, one, how do you take the retail risk associated with those systems? And secondly, how do you scale those businesses up from funding requirements of $5 million to $100, $200, $300 million? So those are the things we're grappling with. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Atto. Sometimes Africa does feel like a very different world when it comes to demand and supply of renewable energy compared to some of the stats we saw Jeremy point out earlier. Well, our final speaker on the regional outlook is Jay Gallegos. He's the General Director for Wind and Energy at CMI Energia, and he has over 25 years' experience in the development and construction of renewable energy projects in the region and many other regions across the world. So please welcome Jay. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for listening. I'd like to share a few perspectives on 24 years working in Latin America in renewables. So there's not much time to cover all of LATAM, but let me start with a little context of who we are. Our story is very much a greenfield development story. So about 24 years ago, I moved to Central America. And over the last 24 years, we've gotten to close to 800 megawatts of renewables. So we have a bit of hydro. We have about 300 megawatts of hydro, 300 of wind, and 200 of solar currently. And we're putting in about another 130 megawatts of solar over the next 14 months, the projects that have PPAs or are under construction. I agree with what the gentleman said earlier. We've been pretty allergic to local partnerships, so we own 100% of all our projects, have developed them ourselves, and led the construction and controlled the projects. We have one partnership because it brought us a 100 megawatt PPA, but other than that, we own 100% of all our assets. Let me talk a little bit about what's happening in Central America first and Latin America to give you a few perspectives. So 6 years ago, if you look at this graph, this is Central America. This is how much solar there was. Wait, there is no solar. So that's true. There was no solar 6 years ago, no utility scale solar in Central America. Costa Rica is very much a hydro story, but you see Central America is mostly hydro and thermal 6 years ago. If you look at it today, it hasn't been spectacular, but you see more yellow now. So there are solar projects. Honduras is kind of the brightest story. Honduras did a feed-in tariff offering north of 15 cents, and they got 400 megawatts very quickly. And now are struggling to pay for it, and there's curtailment and a lot of issues around unpaid incentives, but they got solar in the ground, and it was an interesting experience. You see the rest of the region doesn't have that much solar. And we heard a lot about Costa Rica. I live in Costa Rica, and my wife and 3 kids are Costa Rican. And it's interesting that there's no yellow in Costa Rica. If you look at that, you can barely see it. So the state-owned utility has 1 megawatt of solar, and there's one cooperative that has 5. And I think that's very illustrative of how difficult it's been to get solar and renewables generally onto the grid in Latin America, but right now focusing on Central America. Let me show you why, for example, Costa Rica, there's no solar, because they don't really want it at this point. Hey, this is the official expansion plan, and you see through 2025, no solar installations are planned for Costa Rica. And that's really because there's a very big bet for a huge hydro project, 650 megawatt hydro project, that actually started being developed the year I was born and still has not come to fruition. So working in renewables in Central America, it's quite difficult. There's a lot of political improvisation. It's not easy to understand what the plan is. And so it's very difficult for a development company to invest in development assets. When will something even have an opportunity to get to a bid are huge challenges for us, and something that we're trying to deal with. So Central America, I hear a lot of companies talking about, well, let's head south, from the United States, for example, looking for higher returns. But there are really very few opportunities. They come very far, long periods of time, and a lot of uncertainty around if they will ever do a renewable bid, and if so, kind of what technology will it be? And a lot of these bids have been quite complicated. For example, our large wind project in Honduras, we participated in a bid for capacity with coal because the rules didn't exactly prohibit us from doing that. It was a lot like the movie Babe, where a pig pretended to be a dog, and eventually we got a PPA, but it's really not ideal. And so, it takes a lot of patience it's taken us, as I said, 24 years to build up 800 megawatts. It's been it's been a nice experience, but it's quite difficult. So I would encourage anyone wanting to look to these emerging markets to achieve higher returns to really think carefully about how much time they will need to invest, how many people, and how long it's really going to take. Looking generally at the region, I think we're all familiar with this kind of graphic where you see, just 2.5 years ago, these were awarded bids. You were kind of in the 8-9 cent range. And just 2.5 years later, we're down to below 2 cents in the last bid in Mexico. This is quite an aggressive bid results. And I think what Cristina Figueres said is how we're feeling as well. We're really struggling with how are we going to be competitive in the future, and how can we price in the risks that are still very present in Latin America into these prices? And the answer is we cannot. So we're really kind of thinking about our future and quite concerned about these very low bid prices. I'll give you just one quick story. We had the opportunity to evaluate about 2,200 megawatts of a leading renewable energy company that asked us to take a look at the projects that they wanted to present in the Mexican bid. So that gave us an opportunity to look at 2 gigawatts worth of financial models on hundreds of projects in a country that has very aggressive renewable goals. And when we were finished with the exercise, only 200 megawatts survived, at least our definition of what ready to bid meant. And none of them won in the auction. We were a couple of cents off. We didn't actually bid it because we ended up not associating ourselves with the company. But as we look at financial models, we're just appalled at what we see. So when we've had the opportunity to look at probably 3,000 megawatts of financial models, doing a deep dive into them, and we're just astonished at the assumptions. What it takes to operate a project, OPEX, CAPEX, the assumptions related to after PPA prices, what you're going to get paid for energy when your PPA expires. And so I think that it's almost like these companies have some magic sauce that we don't have, and so we're struggling a bit with that. So I think that Christina's point is, has it gone too low? Are people getting too crazy? I think it's a very valid point. I tell my team often that, at least for Latin America, if it's under 5 cents, you have to have a great story. A really great story. You have 200 megawatts, you're adding 40 right next to it, that type of story. But time will tell if I'm right. I've often been wrong. I'd like to talk about solar capacity in Latin America. It's interesting to take a close look at this graphic. Please notice that, for example, the Argentina, Chile, and Brazil, if you look at these projections from BNEF, they don't change much over the next couple years. So they stay about the same, right? For 2018, 19, 18, 19, and 20. The big story here is Mexico. But of course, a lot of that blue that you see has been bid around 3 cents. So, time will tell how much of that actually gets put in the ground and whether it will ultimately be profitable. So a couple conclusions, and then I'll be happy to answer any questions, or if someone wants to talk to me later about specific countries. I think that the low winning prices are promising, but we'll have to see. But to me, the red is kind of the story, at least for us. I call it the after the wedding, because a lot of people talk about exits kind of being the wedding. Some people talk about financial close or commercial operation, but we still operate that very first project we built 20-some years ago. So for us, the after the wedding risk is really something that we think about a lot. So payment issues, for example. A lot of our off-takers are really struggling. So we often have many millions of dollars of arrears, the inability to collect interest payments, incentives that don't get paid. A lot of things happen in these emerging countries. For example, you can have a couple ships in the port but not be able to get your exonerations through the government. So you have to run down with a $7 million check and at least get your equipment on the ground. We've had a lot of issues around change in law, changes around distributions, payment of taxes, even whether a bank's really a DFI and should be charged taxes. We've had political turmoil. The government of Honduras, for example, was overthrown while we were trying to close financing. A lot of social opposition, a lot of curtailment as well. So to me, kind of getting to the wedding, wherever that is only, it's much like getting married. It's not the same as raising the 3 kids that I have. So we deal with a lot of these things in Latin America, and I'm really questioning whether, at 3 cents, 4 cents, you can properly price in these risks and be profitable in the long term. Now, I'd like to finish by saying that lenders like FMO, Proparco, DG, and those that have accompanied them have been very supportive of us and been very critical to our success, because we've had to deal with a lot of situations, and it's been wonderful to work with them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jay, Atto, and David. We're now going to go into a Q&A time. And I think what we want to do is, I have a few questions for the panel, but we're also going to open up it to the audience for interactions as well. I guess just by way of a first question, David, one of the things you said very unequivocally at the start is, don't partner. I don't know if that will be music to the ears of some governments, but is it really a sustainable model? I know that you focus on local employment, but one of the things we see often in emerging markets is that this whole idea of local content has to move beyond employment. So if I were a government asking you a question in the development of a nascent sector like the solar energy sector, where are the partnerships around the contractor, the service providers? Have you been able to manage that?
Well, the first point is when they ask us that question, we are the local partner. So in all the markets we've gone into, we've set up an IPP which we position as a local player in that market.
Right. Okay.
And we just own that local player. And if you go into our offices, I'd say probably 90–95% of the staff are local. So we're actually taking that local expertise, supplementing it with a bit of IP that we're bringing from other markets and enhancing it. And so from a government perspective, that's far more attractive and far more sustainable. That's what they want to see. They actually want to see knowledge transferring around the region, being brought into their country. They want to see cheap cost of capital and projects built. And obviously you're going to do that if you're transferring knowledge. You've got the financial backing, people like FMO and the capital we bring, and you're employing local staff. Yeah. So it ticks all their boxes. So very sustainable.
You haven't seen significant pushback from certain
No pushback, embrace.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, they love us. We build more than anybody else.
All right, thanks for that view. Actually, I just wanted to ask you a similar question, because we often see this come up time and time again on the African continent. Never mind that the sector is very much in early stages. What's your view on that sort of strategy and approach that David is promoting?
Yeah, I couldn't be further from the skill than he is. I'm on the complete opposite side. I think one of it is obviously driven by local, requirements and what government requires. But at the same time, I think what we've experienced is, if one has the patience and time to go through, what you've been through and develop your own team and develop, the local relationships, then that's fine. You can do that. But if you don't have the luxury of time, what we found is that invariably in all these, certainly in the African markets, you need local friends to unlock transactions and unlock, blockages when they come, because invariably they will come. And when those things happen, you need to be able to call a friend, right? I mean, I think, if you end up having to resolve to things like, legal process and in courts, maybe you get a result, but that's probably 15, 20 years later, and we just don't have the patience for that. And again, I think something that is really significant is not just latching onto a partner who just brings friends, but a partner you can actually grow with, and almost move that model to exactly what he has in mind. The point is, where do you start from? I think you need to start with somebody who's already on ground and understand, and be somebody you can grow with.
Yeah, and just wanting to tease that issue about Africa and the sector, what is actually hampering, in your view, the development of the models that you think will be financeable in the African continent? Because one of the interesting things Jeremy said was about this 100% transition. And some people have always advocated the idea you can't transition Africa from fossil fuels development and consumption to renewable energy. We saw that leapfrog in telecoms. In this sector, it's going to be a lot harder. What do you think are the sticky points?
So firstly, I do think, and again, this is just my personal controversial view, I think it's not particularly fair for a lot of the rest of the world to insist that Africa jumps the fossil fuel cycle and go straight into renewable, just because we can't afford it today, right? I think in my earlier presentation, I talked about the fact that Africa needs to industrialize, whether we like it or not. To industrialize today, we need baseload power, right? You can't have, if I talk about Nigeria, it's 150, 180 million people today, and yet the grid can really only rely on 2,000, 3,000 megawatts, right? It's completely ridiculous. If you take that same environment today, Nigeria has the largest GDP for Africa. South Africa, which has a lot of power, has a slightly lower GDP. So if you could boost the power supply in Nigeria, you can only imagine what it will do to the GDP. I think what we advocate as AFC is that we are supportive of fossil fuels where it's local. So we are not supportive of countries looking to import coal to power. That is not something we're particularly supportive of. But where there is local, so whether that be peat, we've recently financed the peat project in Rwanda. If it's coal in Nigeria, we are completely supportive of that. But renewable has a clear space, right? And again, I mentioned earlier that we see the whole off-grid, mini-grid thing as really significant, because the reality is that there are a lot of people who just don't have access to grid in Africa. And that starts to fill that little gap, for them, where they have some basic supply for their needs. So there is a parallel solution, but it's not one argument. I think both have to go together.
All right, thank you. We're just going to do a poll now, and then there are a couple of questions already for Jay. So we had an audience poll out, and the question in this particular case is, which of these markets do you think we're likely to see the most growth in solar energy investment over the next few years? So let's see what the audience thinks about this one. I think it may take a few seconds for the... All right, another 10 seconds maybe. Okay, so we have, maybe we should put a stop to it now. I guess people are still making up their minds, or they're doing quick Google research online. It's interesting, actually, Jay, Latin America scored very, very low on that particular score. And you also mentioned in your talk the sort of long lead time to develop projects. I mean, pretty much all the time you spent in the region, it's taking projects to come on stream. These factors that you mentioned, like political risk, regulatory risk, how have project developers practically attempted to deal with some of these issues on the ground?
Yeah, it's really, the theme of the conference was making solar bankable.
Yeah.
For us, the story's been keeping it bankable, over the long term. So we've just, certainly we've been most active in Central America, although we've looked actively at Mexico, Chile, and other markets. But it's really been a maintenance. It's really having to work with the government continuously around payment issues, around permitting issues, land tenancy. It took us, just on one project, it took us 100,000 man-hours to resolve land issues because title was not clearly held. And so they're very different places than working in the US where I'd worked previously or larger markets. I think the markets poised to grow the most are those that have clear policies around that, such as Mexico, Brazil, you know, Chile. Argentina is now a new market opening up. My message was just more around the after the wedding kind of story. You know, it's one thing to build up a financial model, get it financed, build the project has, of course, its risks. But I find in Latin America in particular that that's not the end of the story. And so, you know, a lot of the issues that we dealt with happen after, you know, a couple years down the road. For example, these PPAs that were awarded at 14 cents are now being questioned because people are seeing the new bid results. And there's a perspective that the government was taken advantage of. And so in a way, you're constantly defending yourself.
Right.
You know, and that's kind of been, at least for me, the last 24 years, that's something that I'd wished had gotten a lot better. And in some cases, it seems to be getting worse. And around the social issues, you know, we find it ever more challenging. You know, we spend many millions of dollars. Just on one of our projects, we actually had $27 million in the financial model for social projection.
Yeah, so how do you then ever reach profitability on projects if you're spending so many man hours?
Yeah.
Does that mean that the financing ends up becoming primarily public sourced finance as opposed to, you know, private investors suddenly flocking into projects in the region?
Yeah, well, there's kind of an answer before and after. I think before we were able to price that into the PPAs. So we were able to get 8 cents, for example, in Costa Rica. The last 4 bids we won were all won at 8.4 cents. Now in Costa Rica, there are no incentives, so you pay taxes. So keep that in mind. So, but my concern is that Latin America is not changing that much in terms of risk, and yet the prices are dropping just so drastically. So, you know, we're struggling as a company to reconcile those two.
Yeah, so we've got some questions here. There's a question which is quite popular. How can you realize 100% control when by law you're not allowed to own more than 40% of a project as a foreign investor in the Philippines? I don't know if this is factually correct, but maybe you could also answer that.
Foreign ownership requirements, and as I said, you've got to be lawful. But in the Philippines, you're actually allowed to split economic and legal control. So we have 100% legal control. We have all the decision making with respect to the projects. In terms of that 40% of legal control, not economic, what we do is 60% that needs to be local content. We put that in a pension fund for our locally employed staff. And that generates an 8% yield, 8% return, which is in line with the standards in the Philippines, and it equates to about 1% of the economic value of the project.
Right. Okay, so just still picking up on the Asia situation, you mentioned that investors going in should not expect rates of return, you know, above 20%. Is that for all spectrum of investment, or are there people who have a lower threshold in terms of the returns, and what types of project dynamics attract the higher IRRs?
Look, certainly cost of capital varies across the region. So Japan, even though we make more money out of it, it's got the lowest cost of capital market. You know, we're putting in 19-year debt at 60 basis points fixed all in, so that's pretty low cost of capital. You move to India, it's a bit perverse. Actually, you can probably make more money going into the debt product than the equity product. That's just India. It's pretty hard to explain. Rajpal tries to explain it every so often to me, but I'm still confused. But in terms of the markets, what we're seeing is, as I think we heard in LATAM's case, there is compression in terms of tariffs. You've got to watch your cost of capital, but I think those that can manage their construction costs, that are obviously taking out the developer premiums, the land premiums, the construction premiums, I think you're generally finding across all the Southeast Asian markets, you're hitting around 12, 13, 14% returns. India, yeah, I'd probably argue India's lower than that. Some people would definitely argue that it's higher. Japan, lowest cost of capital market, but you're probably closer to 20% returns.
Right.
Just because of that 21-cent tariff. It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's incredible. So Atto, I mean, as someone you worked in project development of projects in Africa, and I think of some of the typical structures we're seeing for projects on the continent. So A project sponsor or a corporate might need a credit enhancement. You might need to put some sort of political risk guarantee. You might need a PCOA. There might need to be a hedging instrument on the local currency funding. And when you put all of that in a bucket and you stand back, you say to yourself, the cost of structuring a project to make it financeable and bankable in the African context, has it been worth it? And then I also don't see many projects like Azura IPP. It's sort of always held up as the poster child for project structuring on the continent, but those are still few and far between. It is very expensive to develop projects in Africa. What can really be done to improve that situation?
So I think, sorry, Mike, you guys hear me? So I think some work is being done at the moment. So for example, there's an organization called AFIDA, which was set up, I think, towards the end of last year, which really seeks to bring together, the key sponsors. And you don't have to be large sponsors. Anyone can join and fund this in Africa. And what that's looking really to do is to help build capacity in government and look to standardize, documentation to the extent it can be. In the time frame we've been developing projects in Africa, I think what we found is the bottleneck tends to be government, right? Invariably, the private sector moves pretty quickly. I think you made the point that good projects find money. And I say that to every client. And, anyone who says there isn't money in Africa just hasn't spent enough time in Africa. There's a ridiculous amount of liquidity in Africa looking for projects. Is really getting the projects to close. So I think a lot of what I see is really just helping government to develop the skills. I mean, I think you talk about Azura. For those of you who don't know Azura, Azura was, I think, a 340 megawatt open cycle power plant that closed in Nigeria 2 years ago. It's going through commissioning right now, incredibly successful. I think it was funded by 12 or so international bankers. Project cost was about a billion in there. I bring Azura up because development took about 4 years on Azura. The expectation was that it would create the template for the next round of projects that would happen. Azura closed, new government came into power, and pretty much anybody who was anybody and who had that experience was kicked out or left. And so those discussions we had on that transaction and the learnings has largely left and needs to be reheld. So today, if we go and see government, we need to explain again, why tariff increase is needed. We need to explain why government support is required. We need to explain why liquidity support is required. So, from where I sit, it's really about looking to entrench skills and resources within the public sector. And as I think AFIDA is a great start. Anybody who wants to join, we'd love to put you in contact with them.
Thanks, Ato. So questions from the audience. How do you operate in markets with lack of local skilled staff? Maybe, Jay, you want to start that, and David can come after that. And another question here is ECA-backed financing important for funding solar projects? Jay?
Yeah, well, I think you want to use local staff, and you just have to take the time to train. I think we have wonderful people. I think most of our staff is local, actually, in each country that we're in, by and large, but it just takes more time, right? And so there's no problem whatsoever in finding people that would love to work with you on renewables.
Can I just tease you a bit more on that? So if you look at the value chain of developing a project locally, are we talking here about the engineers? Are we talking about the manufacturing end? Are we talking about sales? Where exactly, in your experience of Latin America, are the actual skills requirement?
Well, it's not that hard to put together a local development team, so you want a great social person that's going to be very close to the community and lead that. You want to have land experts, because there's a lot of land issues, interconnection. In our case, for example, they're very small grids. When we started working in Nicaragua, the grid's maximum was 650 megawatts, and minimum demand at night was under 200. So these are very small grids. If you put 50 megawatts of wind, it's really going to affect, and it can affect local country or neighboring countries. So I think the development team you put together, that's quite easy. I find great engineering. I mean, the people that keep the lights on in countries with poor resources and that are quite good at what they do and have to be very creative around finding solutions. No problem there. In the wind side, we did have to train up people to do, because we do all our own O&M. You know, right after the warranty period, we just take over and take it from there. That takes a bit more time. It takes 5 to 8 years to train, I think, a credible, at least on the wind side, O&M organization, less on the solar. And then as you start growing, you just start leveraging from your team. You move people around, you know, site manager goes to the new site for a couple of years, and it gets easier and easier. I think it's, so that's kind of, I don't know if that answered the question properly.
It's an interesting perspective.
Yeah.
David, I don't know if you wanted to.
Spot on.
Right.
You know, it's, we do exactly the same thing. They're good land people are local anyway. Grid engineers, high voltage engineers, local. Resource assessments, design, procurement, we probably use international expertise and again, move it around the region, and at that time you're really educating and growing that local team.
Yeah.
So it's you supplement it a little bit.
Yeah, and are you encouraging sort of cross-regional employment as well between regions? Because I guess in some regions, in some countries, you have more or less of a particular requirement for skills.
That's right, and it's so we move staff around the region and get that expertise populating. So we've had one construction manager that's really rotated through our solar business, and he's trained up the local team in terms of construction management. Yeah. And then we, as different markets ebb in and out of deal flow, you know, we'll move staff around the region to keep them active.
Yeah. There was a question in ECA funding, but I wanted to kind of flip it on its head, because ECA funding typically in the African continent, for instance, is looking at project finance. Now, should the question really be do we have the right types of models of projects to fund? So seeing that there's now talk of sort of distributed systems, and much of the infrastructure for funding projects in Africa has been really geared towards utility scale projects, is part of the problem that there is a mismatch. Never mind the requirement for ECA funding on some projects. So if you have off-grid projects, are we using the right funding instruments, or are they available?
I mean, off-grid is I think, a particularly tricky space. I'll speak to that as a subset generally. I think generally, as far as general funding is concerned, I think ECAs are always helpful where you can find them. But again, today, if you look at the margins and tenors you're seeing in the renewable space across Africa, you're talking 18-year money at 4.5% over LIBOR, which 2-3 years ago for Africa was unheard of.
4.5% over LIBOR for local projects.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Okay.
If you speak to that's kind of like what So it was completely unheard of 3-4 years ago, right? And so I think generally, yes, ECA funding always helps, but just given what you see in the market today, I don't think it fundamentally changes the profile or the market. I think you still just need to get good deals. Off-grid, mini-grid is a really difficult space, I think, for most funders to get their minds around. I think most investment banks or most wholesale banks are not set up to take the retail risk that off-grid generally comes with. So whether that is, analyzing 100,000 end users or a few estates or whatever it is, we're not really set up to take that risk and do that analysis. And so looking to scale that up is really, really difficult. I think we're seeing models emerging whereby government is starting to be more supportive. So it's not as far as on-grid where they're giving complete sovereign guarantees and the likes. But we are seeing them giving very large areas to certain things. We are seeing some elements of support. I think Rwanda in particular has a really great model about it. And I think more of those will help give the private sector a bit more confidence, a bit more comfort to start taking more risk in there. But today, as it stands, just given the huge amount of competitors in there, I mean, the barriers to entry aren't that high. It is a difficult business model to wrap your mind around.
David, I wondered whether, seeing as you work on the equity side of investing, in terms of the models that are emerging in places like Africa, they increasingly lending themselves towards more the equity, particularly the distributed, the off-grid, the small-scale models. What have been some of your key learning points that may be of relevance to a market like Africa?
Look, echo a little bit of what was being touched on. We in Asia, we have a number of markets where the domestic capital markets are quite liquid and mature. So you always go to the bank lending market, and they will lend. If your offtake is sovereign or quasi-sovereign, they'll lend. You can convince them to lend. The ECA type financing is really helpful where you've got an immature domestic capital market. So that's where we look to markets like Vietnam, for example, very immature domestic capital market, underfunded. Markets like Indonesia, where it's a little immature and expensive, so we bring in the external funding. In terms of models to think about, I think we go back to what we said before. Good deals will find money, and you don't need to over-lever. I mean, we're private equity guys. I came from a heritage at Macquarie where we loved debt, but when we sold Equus Energy, our gearing ratio was 43%. We just didn't need to put debt into these projects to make them work. And you talk about yield, that's absolutely, as investors, we're focused on yield. And these are high-yielding investments. There's not commodity inputs, there's not combustion technology, there's not waste management. They're 85, 90% EBITDA margin businesses. So it's really a question of your cost of capital because you will be getting a yield back. And so I think we focus too much on debt and trying to perfect debt to make the projects work. The projects are working. We're over that hump of price. We've won that war against thermal power. Now we've just got to win that war with reliability, the baseload power.
So my final question is going to go to you, Jay, and just thinking across the markets. Hydropower is clearly the leader in terms of generating capacity with renewables. And so if you're going to develop the solar energy industry, you need to encourage things that will cause people to develop projects more. For Latin countries, which specific markets do you think in that particular region have the greatest potential for solar energy transition, a rapid one, over the next few years, and why specifically?
Well, I think it's countries that have clear stated policies like Mexico. The question around pricing we've already discussed, but clearly Mexico have very ambitious renewable energy goals. You see Argentina opening up. But there's a lot of risks along the way. I saw a very interesting question around whether you can finance merchant projects.
Right.
And in the past, you had a situation where you had a very aggressive slope upward, in terms of what was expected around the LCOE of each country. But that's completely fallen apart, and so now it's quite difficult. We've seen a number of big projects that have gone on the market recently that have very little PPA life left. And they've been unsuccessful because it's just so hard to get your mind wrapped around what the market, what do you call it, can't speak English anymore, what the price is going to be post PPA. And I think the small developer, if the small developer has a very high quality project, it will probably find its way into the hands of someone that will bid it. The problem is that in solar, it's hard to distinguish yourself as much. And if you're close to a substation, if you do your homework and at least it's interconnectable, what distinguishes you from the other 20 people that are going to bid against you can be very little. It can be your view on interest rates, OPEX, CAPEX. And so I find the financial model today is what's actually winning bids. And that's why I express my concern, because as I look at it, it's almost as if I asked my 3-year-old to set up the chessboard and ask me what's the next best move. It just seems to have gotten extremely aggressive, almost a perfect storm of aggressive assumptions across the board. Right. And those are the projects we're seeing winning bids, and that concerns me. I don't think it's good for the industry for us to fail in these projects.
Yeah. Parting words, Atto and David, Africa parties interested in investment there, what would be your one sort of key message?
I'd say the opportunity is massive, right? I mean, yes, we talked today about tariffs being compressed. At the same time, you still see, yields and IRRs in the high teens. So the opportunity exists. It's painful. I think one must be completely clear about it. But invariably, I think it's worth the effort. I think when you come to Africa, you will find there are friends, there are people who are sympathetic to the challenges you go through. I think people who will help you unblock stuff. And it's clear, I say the opportunity completely exists for Africa. And, once we break through, I think the returns, we're all here to make money at the end of the day. The returns are just incredible.
Fantastic. David?
Well, it's clearly the #1 market. And I think if you're going to come to Asia, you're going to do well if you build your own local management team as your local partner. You will be successful.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I wanted to say, all these regions, we're talking about them as if they're sort of homogeneous entities, but we know that, you know, risk is as much regional, intra-regional as it is between regions. So on that note, I'd like to thank my panel, Jay, Atto, and David, for their expose on their various regions. Thanks, guys.